So we're going to look at to what extent have the last 6 months influenced the way GCs will drive transformational change in the coming years. We're then going to move on to how do we motivate and sustain people through change and transformation in an uncertain world. And then finally, we're going to look at how do you increase value to the business through robust process systems and technology. I'm David Saunders. I am a partner of Evershed Sutherland and head of client development for Konexo, which is Evershed Sutherland's alternative legal service provider. I'm delighted to be joined today by Jacqueline Jardine, who is a senior HR consultant within Konexo and who has delivered a lot of change and transformation over the years that she has worked, and Barbara Hyatt, who is Konexo's head of technology and transformation. Just a couple of housekeeping points before we begin. As Marcella said, please use the Q&A function to ask any questions as we go along. You'll find that in the bar at the bottom of your screen, and we will be answering those questions at the end of the session. And please don't worry, if we don't get round to answering your question, we will follow up direct with you afterwards. Next slide, please. And the next one, please. So I'm going to start my session on looking at the last 6 months and whether this has influenced General Counsel and the way they drive transformational change by taking a step back to the time prior to COVID. And certainly there were some central themes emerging within the legal industry. First of all, in-house teams were busier than ever. And we were seeing an increase in not only the volume of work, but also the complexity of work, driven by many factors, including digitalization, cross-jurisdictional trade, and of course, more recently, COVID-19. We've also seen in the regulated sectors a continual barrage of regulatory change and regulators working cross-border and intervening more in businesses, in particular in financial services. And of course, this is also contributing to both the volume and the complexity of work for in-house teams. The role of the in-house lawyer is also evolving at pace, as well as being proactive risk managers. Increasingly, in-house counsel have responsibilities for managing their external suppliers. And of course, those external suppliers extend beyond now law firms into technology companies and alternative legal service providers. There's a really big job on developing your people and retaining your talented lawyers in a very competitive marketplace and ensuring that they are fulfilling their careers. And of course, most in-house teams are looking to how they demonstrate value to the business in the services that they offer. And crucially, in-house teams want to become more strategic and take on higher value, higher risk work and move away from the routine work, which can sometimes swamp them. In making this shift, they're looking for alternative ways to do the routine work, sometimes through technology, sometimes through passing it back to the business, and of course, using external providers. And we're seeing a rise in legal operations and the recognition that they now play a much more strategic role within their organizations. They've very much shifted from being tactical in nature to being pivotal to the overall strategic direction of the team, driving efficiency and optimizing the way in which the team and their external firms operate. And finally, we know that the external market is moving at pace. The traditional law firm relationship is becoming the centerpiece in a much more diverse market, which provides far greater choice, especially as we operate in a remote environment. And of course, these new entrants include the Big Four accountants, alternative legal service providers, new law arms of traditional law firms, interim lawyers, and technology providers. Late last year, we conducted a survey of in-house lawyers called The New Landscape, A New Perspective. And this looked at the pressures on in-house lawyers and also some of the solutions that they were coming up with. And when you consider the backdrop that I've just talked about, it's not surprising that coming out of that survey, 63% of in-house lawyers felt that they were under increased pressure compared to 12 months previously. And 62% said they were under increased pressure to reduce costs compared to 12 months ago. and 41% cited a lack of resources as the biggest single challenge they were facing as a legal team. Next slide, please. Legal transformation isn't new. We have seen lots of teams drive legal transformation over the last few years to focus on efficiency and optimize their functions. And here are some of the key areas of focus that they've been working on. So firstly, stopping activities that they don't add value. So that might be routine work that could be done differently, maybe pushing it back to the business areas to do that work. Simplifying processes to help teams run more efficiently. So for example, we know that a big pain point for a lot of in-house teams is the intake of work into that team. Very often that's inconsistent and unstructured, using emails and telephones. And we know from our research and the work we've done with teams, this can take up somewhere between 15 and 25% of a lawyer's time. However, applying a process using a consistent approach, perhaps layering on top technology, can vastly improve and make that a more efficient process. Standardizing tasks, so for example, having common templates and playbooks for contracts across jurisdictions, or having frequently asked questions for repeatable advice, both tactics that in-house teams are using to drive efficiency. And then finally, systemizing where possible, using technology to make processes even more efficient. So for example, document automation or intake of instructions. And of course, in-house teams have also been looking at team structure, their people strategy, and critically, the future skills and experience of lawyers that they need in their in-house team. Our experience is that in-house teams are at different stages of their transformation. Some have spent a great deal of time, others have yet started. One of the big drivers behind it has been enterprise-wide transformation projects or cost reductions. And we're seeing an acceleration now as we've gone through 6 months, 7 months of COVID-19, with a lot more teams focused on transforming. Next slide, please. So what have we seen over the last 6 months? Well, unsurprisingly, we've seen everyone operating in some shape or form remotely. And we've never experienced that in the volume that we've seen over the last 6 months. We've had to deal with everything from moving to a home environment, maintaining productivity, increased workloads in particular for in-house teams, engaging with stakeholders of our platforms such as Zoom and Teams, and getting to grips with new technology and maintaining culture and motivation and well-being of our people. For many of us, this has been a very successful transition, and this has turbocharged perhaps the move to a more agile, scalable resourcing methodology going forward. Secondly, and unsurprisingly, teams are facing even greater cost scrutiny than they ever have before. Huge pressure on headcount, huge pressure on costs, and this is driving enterprise-wide transformation, which in turn is having pressure on the legal teams as well. And that, of course, is particularly acute in some industries and sectors. Thirdly, we're seeing legal teams really at the epicenter of the crisis. I saw a survey recently in Asia that said that 37% of general counsel were helping to shape their organization's response to COVID-19, and they were also shaping the future strategy for return to work and other issues. And we know that legal teams are incredibly busy. They've had lawyers firefighting, lawyers moving to different areas to work on areas such as employment law and commercial contracts, areas where there's been real pinch points for in-house teams. And they've been working longer and longer hours than they ever have done before. Next slide, please. So now more than ever, there's a greater emphasis on maximising efficiency and future-proofing the legal team. We're seeing a number of transformational trends emerge through this crisis. And unsurprisingly, the return to the office and the future of work is first and foremost on most general counsel's list. Having worked through the last few months, teams are now planning for the future. A lot are looking, from my experience, of a balanced approach, a scalable and agile-based operating model, which will see some time in the office and then some time working remotely. And of course, the impact of working from home, working remotely, is still unknown in many areas. So, for example, take work-life balance. I know from my own experience that I would typically have a commute, which I no longer do, and I'm seeing a lot more of my family because I'm working from home. Balanced against that, I think working from home, certainly from my experience, has meant that I'm working harder than I ever have done before. Hiring strategy is another area that perhaps will benefit from remote working, as office location is going to be less important in the future. And that might mean that you're able to hire people who are further away from the office locations. And then, of course, the impact on company culture and team culture is yet to be tested fully. Many have said that the micro interactions they have with their colleagues, which are so essential for building relationships and doing business, are missing when we're working in a remote environment. We're seeing laser focus on the right people doing the right work. And this means that, as I said earlier, teams are looking to find different ways to do the more routine work. I'm often asked by in-house counsel, how do you start to determine who's doing the right work and how to do it in the right way? And a good place to start, and Barbara will touch upon this later, is to look at the data within the teams, who's doing what and how they're doing it, and analyze that data to come up with a better and more efficient and effective operating model that utilizes your lawyers in the best way possible. We're seeing a lot of time spent upskilling the business, and because this is a move away from the legal teams doing more routine work, as they take on more strategic work, they need to find different ways of doing it. And in particular, we're seeing things like commercial contracts being done more and more by the business or procurement teams, with the legal team providing the support and infrastructure to facilitate that happening. So providing business templates, playbooks, and automated tools to assist with them. And we're seeing quite a bit of work on the lawyers of the future. What are the skills being required now by general counsel of their teams? It's a given that commerciality, influencing skills, communication are key to the success of in-house lawyers. But perhaps now more than ever, we're also seeing adaptability, managing change, resilience, featuring more and more on the radar for general counsel as they look to their teams and the skills that are required. And of course, for the general counsel, it's about what is their role for the future. They've been so prominent in a lot of organizations over the last 6 months dealing with the crisis, and now they need to stay relevant and strategic as we look forward to the future. We're seeing an increased use in technology, and Barbara will talk about this later. And some of the tech that we're seeing in-house teams use include collaboration and communication sites, the ability to show value through using tech, case management systems, and of course, document automation. And finally, we're seeing that the external legal ecosystem is evolving at pace. There are significant alternative providers that are featuring in organizations' buying strategies, particularly for certain types of work that don't need to be done by law firms. These new providers are often very complementary in nature to law firms and provide a strategy for in-house teams to push out work to a lower cost center. So, for example, what are we seeing in this space? We're seeing interim lawyers being used to backfill and work on projects. We're seeing interim lawyers being used as an extension of an in-house legal team to support the work that is currently being done. We're seeing legal consultancies work with in-house legal teams on their efficiency and optimization. And we're seeing bundles of lower risk work being sent out to alternative legal service providers. And I want to do a poll to see what key transformational themes you're all seeing as you go about the last few months. So if we can bring that poll up, please, Dan. So the question, as you'll see, is what are your legal team's key transformation tactics to address COVID-19 and the new normal? And you can answer on a multiple choice basis, so answer as many times as you want. Give it 20 more seconds for everyone to complete that. And then Dan, if you can get the results up on screen, please. Okay, let's get the results up, Dan. So as you can see, and unsurprisingly, a large percentage looking at how they're going to operate in the future. Technology features, as you'd expect it to be, as teams look to do things more efficiently. And then that third category of focusing on that strategic higher value work and perhaps finding different ways to do the more routine work. And if we go to the next slide and take the poll down, please. We can just get the poll down.
The poll is down. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. You can see this was an identical survey that we undertook in conjunction with the ACC in Asia, and you can see very similar results of the polls out there. So again, moving to remote working and a more flexible working pattern being top, increase in use of technology, and then focusing on more strategic work in-house are the three top ones there as well. So if I have the next slide up, please. So finally from me, I believe we're seeing an acceleration in transformation over the last 6 months within legal teams. And I think this will continue as functions look to optimize the way in which they work during this crisis. And as we look into the future, I think it will involve a combination of what I've put on this slide. So in-house teams focused on strategic work, aligned to business units, decisions being driven by data so that the right people are doing the right work, and critically, the right location is considered. And we may also see, I think, in-house teams becoming more senior as they really begin to focus on that really strategic work. I can see a real role for legal operations going forward, whether that's a separate function or someone with the legal team focused on it, looking at strategy, technology, transformation, supplier management, and other key operational areas. Again, freeing up the general counsel and the senior lawyers to focus on that strategic legal work. And I can see a more diverse use of external suppliers driven by a more sophisticated buying model, again ensuring that the right people, the right organizations externally are doing the right work. And I think we'll all see a future of work strategy that reflects the strategy and culture of our organizations. And for many, this will be a balance between working at home or working remotely and working within the office. Thank you for listening to me. I'm now going to hand over to Jacqueline. As I said, Jacqueline is one of our senior HR consultants, and she has led and delivered change across many different functions and companies over the years. One of the hardest things in any transformation project is motivating and sustaining people, and Jacqueline's going to talk you through her experiences of how to do this.
Thank you, David. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, David. My name is Jacqueline Jardine. Today, even more than normal, ladies and gentlemen, we are working in an uncertain world. Who would have thought 7 months ago we would be where we are today? And therefore, how you motivate and sustain people through change and transformation is even more important today. And how you do that will be the difference in whether you have engaged employees through that transformation and change. It's really important for yourself as leaders to first of all think and consider how you react to change, ladies and gentlemen. So I'm going to kick off this morning's session by asking you 2 questions. I would just ask you to give your first thought that comes into your head and pop it in the Q&A. And then I'm going to use your answers later on in my session this morning. So if I could ask you the first question, ladies and gentlemen. When you first went into lockdown in the middle of March, How did you feel? First thoughts that come into your head, ladies and gentlemen, if you could just put that in the Q&A, please. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. So we've got different feelings, different emotions: challenged, apprehensive, exhausted, a bit worried. Felt okay. Was interested in how life and work was going to play out. Unsecure, relaxed. A whole range of emotions, ladies and gentlemen. Uncertain, stressed. As you can see, there is that range of emotions. Somebody's felt invigorated, free to organise their work as they wanted. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for those of you who answered that question. I'm now going to ask my second question. Now, today, at this point in time, how do you feel about COVID and the changes that perhaps have impacted you personally and professionally? Again, if I could just ask you to put your first thoughts in the Q&A for me, that would be fantastic. Thank you. So some of you are feeling scared, upset and scared. Some of you are feeling more secure. Some of you are feeling a bit like what David said, busy, and there's lots of things to deal with. Some of you are feeling normalised. It's maybe become a new norm. And some of you also are feeling more secure and more confident. So again, ladies and gentlemen, what we see is a range of emotions. Some of you are also exhausted. 7 months down the line, it could be taking its toll. And for some of you, it's been an interesting journey, perhaps a little bit exciting, a little bit different. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I really appreciate you giving me those responses, and I'm going to refer back to them later on in this session. Next slide, please. So let me just explain what was going on, and the reason that I asked you to sort of tell me how you felt, ladies and gentlemen, when you're thinking about how you will motivate and sustain people through change and transformation. Change and transition are two different things. So change is that external event. However, transition is for you personally and people in your teams, that internal alignment with what has gone on. How do you adjust? How do you sort of make sense of that change event? And so they're very different, ladies and gentlemen. And at this point in time, for each one of us, we could have a whole range of emotions. We may also not experience all the emotions of our colleagues and people in our teams. And therefore, it's how do we manage that as leaders in change and transformation? So you may plan a change, but we're also having to deal with, at the moment, ladies and gentlemen, unplanned change. And potentially, as people just think they're getting to the new norm, something else shifts. And so that change is continuously moving. We also know that change can create uncertainty. And with uncertainty, it brings both downsides, perhaps people, as some of you said, feeling a sort of a loss, perhaps emotional and intellectual overload. Sometimes it can lead to personal paralysis. However, it can also create an upside. People can feel energized, as some of you said. It can increase creativity. It keeps us alert, and it can also bring sort of more confidence. In any change and transformation, individuals, people in your team, even maybe yourself, will be asking, what's in it for me? Also, what's required of me? What's the pain? A useful model that I'm going to share with you now, ladies and gentlemen, which really helps, I think, explain what may be going on for people through that whole change and transition, is a model by a gentleman called David Rock, and it's his SCARF model. Next slide, please. Some of you may have seen this model, but for me, I think it's a really useful tool to help understand what might be going on for people through change in that transition. David Rock, for those of you who may not be aware, is an American psychologist and neurologist, has done an awful lot of research and written some really interesting articles, really understanding what goes on, how our brain is wired, and what goes on when we are faced with different, what we call social circumstances. So I'm just going to explain a little bit more detail about this model, because I think it can really help you as leaders in speaking to your teams and going through change and transformation, what's going on for them to really understand. It's also a powerful tool, ladies and gentlemen, to use in one-to-one conversations and other performance conversations. So it really is a tool for all weathers, as I like to say. So his model has what we call 5 social concerns: status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. I'm now just going to explain the model in a little bit more detail so that hopefully you can understand how you could use this to understand what might be going on for people. How might people be feeling at a point in time? Status is the degree to which an individual perceives their status, their relative importance to others. It's their social standing. It indicates who they are. And status is linked to people's values. They're inner drivers, ladies and gentlemen. If through change and transformation, somebody may be displaced, then potentially they may perceive their status as being impacted in a less positive way, for example. Certainty, that's the degree to which an individual, yourself, perhaps members of your team, require a level of certainty, stability, familiarity. As we've experienced over the past 7 months, probably nothing's been familiar. There's been lots of external changes, and how we've then come to terms with that is how we realign through that transition. Autonomy, the degree to which you believe you have control over events or the responsibility for something. Relatedness, the degree to which you may feel you belong to a group. That sense of inclusion, ladies and gentlemen, the sense of safety with others. So, you know, just thinking about with more of us working from home, and as David said, we've lost perhaps some of that sense of safety, that psychological safety when we've got others round about us. We may have family members round about us, but we've lost that collegial team environment. And how do we create that again? And finally, fairness, ladies and gentlemen, the degree to which you perceive you're being treated fairly, that there's an even playing field. And through transformation, people may perceive there isn't a fair exchange. So the human brain, let me just explain how this works to minimize threat and increase or maximize reward. Stimuli associated with positive emotions, as some of you said that that's how you felt exhilarated, quite excited about what was happening in the current world, and that will trigger a reward sense in our brains, ladies and gentlemen. But stimuli associated with negative emotions and experiences will be seen as a threat and may trigger what we call an away response. So these responses are not purely mental or behavioural. Data gathered, and Barbara will talk more about data, to measures such as brain activity, and this is the work that David Rock did as a neurologist, you know, through MRI scans, etc., shows that threats of any of the social concerns, status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, fairness, can trigger physiological responses as well, in the same way as a physical threat. So just like we are attracted, perhaps move towards food, and also we move away from predators. So when you are leading through change and transformation, ladies and gentlemen, what you want to be able to do with your colleagues, with your employees, is ensure that they are more in the reward frame of mind, hopefully in that capacity. So understanding what might be going on for somebody at a point in time is really helpful. And for some individuals, there may be more than one of these social concerns at play. I know for me personally, fairness is a big driver, is a big motivator. And if I feel that perhaps there isn't an equal playing field, what you may see in me is those less positive behaviours. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to talk about transition in a little bit more detail, ladies and gentlemen. So if you remember, we said that the actual change event is the external event. How you and I align with that is actually transition. How do we align our emotions? And when I asked the questions at the beginning of the session today, lots of people, when we first went into the lockdown, felt anxiety, there was a bit of shock, there was some frustration. Some people said they were expressing, feeling stress. Others actually were quite positive. There was that upside of the uncertainty. And as you can see here, it's about endings. It's the loss of the familiar. We then go through that exploration stage, which sometimes can feel a bit chaotic. And what we want to be able to do is transition into those new beginnings, to have that energy, to have that connection and that recommitment. So people can be feeling lots of different emotions, and no two people will be feeling the same emotions. Also, depending on when people learn about information to do with the change and transformation, there could be lots of different transition curves going on at the same time. Just as a point of interest, ladies and gentlemen, in the general population, we say that there are 20% of people who are what we call innovators. They love change, they'll be for it, they'll support it. There are also 60% of people who are what we call adopters. These are the people who, well, suck it and see. And then finally, you have 20% of people who are what we call traditionalists, who will drag their heels, will make it as difficult as possible and will resist change. However, it's really important, ladies and gentlemen, or perhaps a helpful guide, to use these percentages thinking about your own teams when you are leading through change and transformation, because it's quite helpful as a rule of thumb. Next slide, please. Therefore, leading through change, ladies and gentlemen, is really important. You as leaders need to support employees through the whole process. And that's managed by active communication, being in touch, being accessible, being proactive. I'm going to now just share with you some practical tips about what that might look like, especially in today's world. Engagement is critical, and it's the change psychology of individuals. Because just as we've said, psychologically, change is a serious disruption to an individual's need for security, predictability, that need for control, those elements from Rock's scarf model. Compound this at the moment with complete uncertainty, changing guidance around the pandemic and COVID. So people's level of anxiety can be disabling, as we say. So thinking of you as a leader, being actively communicating with people, how can you help people? Think about using David Rock's scarf model. Help those impacted by change by understanding the difference they can make in the future. So linking it to status. Provide clarity on the next steps and time scale. So that's giving people that certainty. Help others understand how they will be able to manage and prioritise in the future. So again, you're giving them autonomy. Emphasise that social psychology and that relatedness, that safety. Tell people about your own change journey, the questions you asked. Make people feel included. How do you create those collegial moments that perhaps people are missing now because they're not meeting in the coffee break or the water cooler? How do you create them in that virtual world? something to think about. And then finally, engage and involve others in the change process so that they have a sense of fairness. Next slide, please. So just to conclude, ladies and gentlemen, there are certain actions, thinking in a practical perspective of what you can do. So when we are faced, or when people in your teams and even yourself are faced with anticipation, not knowing or expecting what's going to happen, as leaders, you need to communicate. Communicate, communicate, communicate. I cannot say enough, and from my experience working with some clients through this time, it is you cannot over communicate, ladies and gentlemen. But you do need to think about making that communication agile, thinking about the potential of time delays and just how to do it. Not necessarily doing what you've done previously, thinking about creating a new baseline, ensuring everybody has equal voice. When we're at the letting go and people are perhaps facing the facts that things are going to be different, but they're not quite wanting to let go of that past, you need to listen as a leader. And it's listen to hear, ladies and gentlemen, not tell. How do you create that sense of community? And that's where your individual adaptive leadership will be really important. Understanding your own individual team members, and what's right for one person might not necessarily be right for the next person. And disorientation, when things are no longer as they were, but they're not quite there yet, you need to be direct. You need to give clarity and let people know what is happening. As we're coming out into those new beginnings, then it's about engaging. How do you engage people? How do you create that sense of community, involve them in that future state? And then finally, ladies and gentlemen, once we're recommitting, you need to coach. Coach those individuals, help them create that future, and longer term, encourage a culture of feedback and learning reviews. In conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, as Cotter and Cohen said in a 2002 Harvard Business School press, and as I mentioned at the beginning, the central challenge in leading change is not strategy, it's not systems, it's not culture. These elements and many others are very important. However, the core problem, without question, is behaviour. What people do and the need for significant shifts in what people do. I hope this morning I have been able to share with you how you can influence this behaviour, but how you motivate and sustain people through change and transformation. However, as Cotter and Cohen state, systems, data, processes and technology can be very important through change, as Baba will now explain to you. Thank you very much.
That's great. Thank you, Jacqueline. If we can go to the next slide, please. Great. So the use of technology, over the years has been trending upwards and really has become front and center during the pandemic as teams have been forced to adapt quickly to new ways of working. But technology alone isn't the answer to delivering more efficiency, managing risk, and identifying opportunity. And I wanted to bring up the diagram that David had shown earlier to highlight that digital transformation is really about combining technology with process change and people, as well as capturing and following the data at each stage so that you're continually improving. To deliver really value to your business, the key thing is to start with objectives and understand the challenges. Really think about questions like, what business outcomes are you looking to achieve? Are the team focused on the right tasks and activities and those that deliver the greatest impact? What is the volume, complexity, or specialism of the work that's being done, and how much time does that take? What activities could the business use as potentially self-service? So really being very specific around the types of objectives that you have and identifying some of the challenges really help you point to doing things differently by potentially changing the process, potentially changing the operating model, and the right combination of bringing the right combination of technologies. And the key to having objectives and challenges laid out very clearly also gives you a measure of success and tracking return of investment. If we could go to the next slide, please. In the last few years, the legal tech market has grown rapidly, driven by inefficiencies and opportunities that exist within our industry. Investment globally, I believe in 2019, surpassed the $1 billion mark, but that has led to a plethora of different technologies, which has made it difficult to decide which technologies to potentially invest in, which solutions actually solve some of the challenges faced in terms of functionality and security and how they work with some of the things that you already have in place. It can be hard to secure budget to review and test every single technology. You certainly don't want to be doing that. And often, actually, it's a combination of different tools that solve the challenges that are being faced. So coming back to objectives and the challenges you want to focus on really help guide the prioritization of the areas that you and the technologies that you really look at. If we can go to the next slide, please. So we've created a technology maturity model based on our experience of working with in-house teams to track where an organization is and where they want to get to, based on what is most appropriate, most proportionate to the business. We found that most find themselves to the left between the manual and central phase, with some investment into areas such as document management and an initial capture of data on things like volumes of activity or potentially spend. And some organizations have made progress in implementing specific solutions like document automation or reporting tools like Power BI and Tableau, and combining these with different operating models. I think the crucial thing, as both David has mentioned and Jacqueline have mentioned, the crucial thing is capturing data about the work that's being done at each stage of the process, and following that data to really drive continuous improvement. Where is the volume, for example, by region, by team, by division, by work type, identifying where the noise is. And then you can use that data to drive automation, starting small, proving the value of solving a particular set of challenges or answering a particular set of questions. And then, such as what are the routine requests, which could be addressed by a standard document or an FAQ, or potentially a more structured intake triage process using the concept of a legal front door, or potentially which requests could be self-serviced by business users as they are repetitive, standard, and low complexity, such as the creation of some NDAs. So really being able to capture data, follow that data, and then use that data to drive automation is quite key as we see. So that takes us on to maybe the next poll. If the next poll could be brought up, please. And we'd be interested in the views of those who have joined around some of the initiatives you are expecting to focus on in the next 12 to 24 months. We'll give everyone a minute to answer the question. We'll give everyone another 10 seconds. Great, Dan, if you can bring up the results, please. So this is really interesting. So it looks like contract review tools. There's a high area of focus on those tools. Equally, in fact, not too far behind are matter and case management, document automation tools, and reporting and analytics. And reporting and analytics is some of the things that we've talked about in terms of data collection as well. That's great. If we can move to the next slide. Great. So on screen are two charts. Left is late last year as part of the in-house report that David had mentioned earlier. And on the right is an ACC session that we held recently. And it's interesting, you know, we are seeing a bit of variation in the results of today's poll and what we've seen in the past. But there's certainly accelerated focus, I think, we're seeing in areas which help with greater levels of automation, greater levels of collaboration. You know, contract reviews have consistently been areas that we're hearing as quite a key area for organizations to focus on. Reporting and analytics, I think, consistently is an area that we're hearing from in-house legal teams on the importance of being able to capture some of the data that's being that sits across the organizations, being able to report on that more effectively, more visually, so that you can start to connect that different data. And also analytics, really the next stage of using data, using analytics as a way to inform future outcomes. So it's very interesting to see that. And of course, as I mentioned, we're seeing a lot of acceleration across some of these areas driven by COVID-19. And I think there is a realization that technology actually works, and we'll continue to see this trend in the coming years. Some of the aspects to consider when you think about process and technology and transformation are, you know, as you think about leveraging tools and process changes, really around potentially looking at leveraging tools that you may already have in-house. We're seeing much greater use of things like the Microsoft technology and Microsoft ecosystem to support business processes such as intake using Microsoft Forms and Microsoft Flow. We often hear that there is a knowledge barrier around how you actually go about collecting data and then reporting on data. And really, you know, starting small, collecting data in repositories or places that you are familiar with, whether it be the likes of Excel or SharePoint, and then using tools such as Power BI, which your organizations may already have, can really help very quickly bring together some of those different data elements and help you visualize and help prioritize and allocate work based on some of that information. And then we've seen in this poll and previous polls, sharing information while working remotely is key, particularly at the moment. And so case and matter management, which was some of the high responses that we just saw in the poll, to share work and to also collaborate on docs in real time has become increasingly important.